In 1967, the NHL would commence its first major expansion period. The league would double in size with the addition of 6 new franchises: the Philadelphia Flyers, the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Minnesota North Stars, the St. Louis Blues, the LA Kings, and the California Seals. Most of these franchises would see some form of significant success in the NHL over the ensuing decades, but unlike the previous 5 I mentioned, the Seals franchise in particular would fail to generate any significant momentum and suffered from a myriad of problems both on and off the ice. The Seals would barely last a decade in the NHL before they eventually relocated in 1976. Today, the team is remembered as one of the biggest flops in the history of the NHL's expansion. Hello everyone, my name is King Gratz and welcome back to the channel. Today, I'll be discussing the story of the California Golden Seals in the NHL, primarily looking at the team's history, its founding, as well as the constant issues of ownership and incompetent management, and also the issues on the ice for this team performance-wise. This is probably going to be the first of maybe 2 videos on this topic, where in this video I'm going to be providing everything leading up to the franchise's eventual discussion of relocation, so please keep an eye out for part 2. This is probably going to be a longer video, so I highly suggest if you take the time to sit down, grab something to eat, and just listen to me for the next little bit, and I really appreciate your support. And without further ado, let's dive in. So the Seals entered the NHL in, I think, actually a more complicated manner than what I actually thought when I first knew about this team. While they were a expansion club, no less, in the 67 expansion year, they actually had an existence prior to the NHL. The Seals initially existed as the San Francisco Seals of the Western Hockey League, or the WHL for short, and the WHL had an existence in the 50s and 60s as a potential rival to the NHL. Now, the 67 expansion really happened for 2 reasons. Number one, the NHL was obviously hoping to expand into more American markets and grow the sport of hockey altogether. But number 2, which is probably more important in my opinion, was the fact that the NHL wanted to prevent the Western Hockey League from becoming a major rival and potentially interfere with the NHL's monopoly on hockey talent. Of course, this would be an issue in the 70s when the World Hockey Association came in, but we still have some time before that happens. Now, the NHL was hoping to shut down the Western Hockey League's potential of becoming a major hockey league in North America, primarily by getting into some markets that it would potentially compete in. And one of those was, of course, in California. Now, Barry Van Gerbig was awarded an NHL expansion team, and his idea was to buy the San Francisco Seals of the WHL and transfer the team into the NHL as part of the 67 expansion. The franchise would also relocate to Oakland, California, which would move to the opposite side of the bay from where San Francisco is, and the real goal here was to show that Oakland could become a viable place for future sports leagues altogether. Now, the first major hurdle, like all expansion teams, is the expansion draft, and the 67 expansion draft especially should be considered, considering that the NHL was entering a new era altogether. The original 6 clubs had major protections on most of their star players, and this led to slim pickings for all of the incoming franchises, with very little talent to choose from. Most of the players that were available were either cast-offs from across the NHL or veteran talent at the very best, or really guys who probably were just, I guess you could say, scrubs in the league at the time. Every of the incoming expansion teams had their own strategy when it comes to the expansion draft, and it should be noted that all of the new expansion teams were going to be put into their own division, and therefore there was technically an even playing field when it comes to trying to make the playoffs in the early going. Now, the Seals' plan was to try and retain a sizable number of its players from the WHL days, and this was primarily how they were going to structure the franchise moving forward. Now, this didn't really provide much support for the team in the early going, as the franchise basically stunk, and it wasn't surprising. And the early failure of the Seals in Oakland would lead to very poor fan attendance and already a financial downfall for the franchise. The team would ultimately rename for the first time as the Oakland Seals, but this wasn't officially approved by the NHL until December of 1967, so you can already see kind of the problems with the branding altogether right now and trying to actually get it out there. Now, as a result of the early failures, Van Gerbig would attempt to consider the idea of relocating and essentially making threats to move the team altogether out of California. Now, the first early reports of this was when Bert Olmsted, who was the first-year coach and general manager of the Seals at the time, actively supporting the idea of relocating the franchise to Vancouver, BC. And this would prompt the Labatt's Brewery to offer to buy the Seals from Van Gerbig and relocate the franchise to Vancouver, British Columbia, but the NHL would shoot this down almost immediately. In addition to this, the Knox brothers from New York State would then attempt to buy the franchise and propose to relocate them to Buffalo, New York, but this was also shot down by the NHL. Now, Buffalo and Vancouver were both rejected for the 1967 expansion, and there was genuine interest from both of these cities to bring in an NHL team, and this ultimately combined with the potential sale of the Seals to both of these prospective buyers would lead to the 1970 expansion, bringing in the Buffalo Sabres and the Vancouver Canucks. Now, the Seals, after their inaugural season, they would go through a major overhaul internally in the hopes of trying to improve on the ice, but this didn't really do too much. The team was still well below 500 in their second season, but this was good enough to finish second in the newly minted West Division of all the new expansion teams, and the Seals would make the playoffs. Their first opponent would be the LA Kings, and in fact, I found that the Seals were actually favored to beat the Kings in the first round of the postseason that year, but ultimately they were upset in a 7-game series. The following season, the Seals would make the playoffs again, but this time they would be a much more diminished team when it comes to talent, and they were much worse. They barely squeaked into the playoffs, and they were ultimately swept by the Pittsburgh Penguins. And as a side note here, this would be the last time they would ever make the playoffs. Van Gerbig was also starting to suffer financially here, and he was planning to try and sell the team to a prospective buyer in the area. In preparation for the 1969-70 season, he attempted to sell the team to Transnational Communications and their owners, but the prospective buyers actually filed for bankruptcy before the deal could be completed, so Van Gerbig held on to the franchise into that season. Fast forward to the 1970-71 season, and Van Gerbig would finally get his wish, and he would sell the team to Charlie Finley, who was also the owner of the Oakland Athletics of Major League Baseball. Finley was very much known as a flamboyant and eccentric owner, and a lot of people will remember him for his unorthodox approaches to team branding and promotion and all that kind of stuff. He did this with the Athletics in Major League Baseball. He would try to apply the same attributes to the Seals in the NHL. So, in the hopes of trying to promote the team and to garner more fan attendance, he would do a number of things. Number one, he would try to rename the team. Twice. First, he would rename them to the Bay Area Seals, and after just 2 games in the 70-71 season, he would then rename the team again, this time to the California Golden Seals, which is how most people will remember the name. Now, the major rebrand was a failure, as the team would finish with the worst record in the NHL for that season, and from a managerial point of view, the team wasn't any better. I will admit, Finley's innovations did sort of stick in the NHL. One of his things was that he would have the Seals players fly first class on commercial flights to long-distance road trips, and this would actually become a mainstay in the NHL. As we see today, every franchise will have a chartered flight for their team in order to fly their players to a road game on the other side of the continent, for example. And so, technically, we have Charlie Finley to thank for making that a reality. Now, as I mentioned, the managerial side of things for the Seals were just as incompetent as the team was on the ice. The Seals, for example, would trade their unprotected 1971 first-round pick to the Montreal Canadiens alongside of Francois Lacombe in exchange for Ernie Hick, cash, and a first-round pick of the Canadiens in 1970, which was used to select Chris Odlifson. Now, as a result of the Seals having a horrific season that year where they finished at the bottom of the league standings, and the fact that this pick was unprotected, this would allow for the Canadiens to select future franchise great and Hall of Famer Guy Lafleur. And arguably this is considered today to be one of the most lopsided trades in NHL history, and a franchise-defining trade for the Canadiens and also for the Seals as well. Now, in the early 70s, the Seals would also suffer from the rise of the World Hockey Association, who would early on in the 70s have a very strong effect at allowing players from the NHL to defect to the rival league to get lucrative contracts. Now, the Seals would lose a large chunk of its talent to the World Hockey Association, primarily because Charlie Finley was a cheap owner and he was not interested in trying to match any of the contract offers from the World Hockey Association for his players. And as a result, the Seals would lose a good chunk of its talent pool by the time you get to the 1972 season. And as a result, the Seals would once again flounder in the basement of the NHL, and they would basically be like that for the rest of the franchise's history. Finley would eventually start to lose his patience with the fact that the franchise was constantly in the bottom of the standings, and compared to the Oakland Athletics, who were actually very successful in the 70s during this time, Finley just simply lost his patience and decided that he was just going to sell the team. The selling of the Seals in the early 70s was a very complicated task, primarily because there really weren't any prospective buyers that were looking to get the team and keep them in the Bay Area. A lot of the people who were interested in buying the Seals pretty much wanted to relocate the franchise altogether to a completely different area, and the NHL was not interested in doing this. Now, going back to when we had interest from Vancouver and Buffalo to bring the Seals to those respective cities, the reason why the NHL basically didn't do that was primarily because the NHL had secured a lucrative TV rights deal with CBS, and this deal was requiring at least 2 franchises to exist in the California region. So you already have those 2 with the California Seals and the LA Kings. But the Seals, because of their uncertainty and the fact that if they did relocate, this deal basically would fall through for the NHL, this was the primary reason why the NHL refused to relocate the franchise back in the late 60s, early 70s period. Now, in 1973, Finley would attempt to sell the team to a Indianapolis-based group who were planning on relocating the Seals to Indiana, but the NHL Board of Governors would shoot this down, and Finley basically had no options left. With no real credible buyers that were interested in keeping the team in its current place, Finley decided to sell the Seals to the NHL for $6.585 million. And with Finley out of the picture, the NHL was now in a period of really long uncertainty regarding the Seals franchise. There was really no clear direction as to what the team was going to do for its future, and essentially you enter this period of, I'm going to say maybe a year and a half, where the NHL was looking to find an owner for the Seals franchise and were hanging on to it. Essentially, they were threatening to either relocate the team altogether because of a lack of support, or to even potentially liquidate the franchise if they couldn't find a buyer for the team. And that is going to be the subject for part 2 of this series. So please stick around for part 2, where I will continue the story there. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this one. Thank you again, and I'll see you all in my next video.